And John is with us from Washington. So, John, our new CBS News Battleground Tracker polls show Trump tied with Clinton in Florida and now up a point in Ohio. Is this just the typical polls tightening in the final days of an election, or do you think that there is actually some momentum now for Donald Trump heading into Tuesday?
I think it's the polls tightening. Those states are tight, so even the idea of momentum in Ohio and Florida is a little tricky because the states are so thoroughly organized and people are so used to voting and used to being engaged in the party process that the swings are never vast. But we definitely see in other places, and we certainly see movement in the race as Republicans come home to Donald Trump. That's happening in those two states. And as we see the Clinton machine and the Clinton operation try to ramp up votes in the cities where she is relying on minority voters and younger voters. So it's kind of what we'd expect in a battleground state in an election where it's so close when there's not something diverting into a sort of special case, which we've had a few of those too.
Well, John, with just 2 days to go, what does each candidate need to focus on?
Well, what they need to focus on basically turning out their voters. So you see Donald Trump is in Minnesota and he's in Michigan trying to find a way, if there are his kind of voters, those blue collar voters where that he does well with, if there are enough of them in those states that if Democratic voters don't turn out, that he could maybe stage a surprise. Those are two traditionally Democratic states. Hillary Clinton has to focus on driving up the African-American vote in the swing states and making sure she holds the traditionally Democratic states. And she has to hope that those reluctant Republicans or college-educated voters, particularly college-educated women, turn out in big numbers in states where they're a big share of the electorate and in those sections, particularly the suburbs, where a lot of them live.
John, you mentioned Michigan. How likely is it that Trump could actually flip a state like Michigan, which has been a traditionally Democratic state?
You'd have to put it on the outside of his likely options. On the other hand, just because it's a state that traditionally votes for the Democrat, the Clinton campaign has a ground operation there. There is this situation, or has been in the past, where Republican candidates have tried to make a play into these Democratic states. But at the last sort of 3 percentage points that you would need to get in the polls turns out to be the hardest. So you can get close, but it's very hard to go over the line. So on the other hand, there are a lot of blue collar voters in that state. So you know, it's like anything could happen in this election. So it's not it's not as if he went to Vermont or something, but it's definitely a gamble on his part, because if you're in Michigan, you're not in other states where you might need to be if it's a little closer in those states.
Well, John, we know that the polls have shown voters don't really like or trust either one of these candidates. What do you think that could possibly mean? What's your sense of who might have an advantage when it comes to turnout on Election Day? We don't really know. I mean, so because it goes to more than whether people are really enthusiastic or even trust the candidates, that you can have, if you have a strong enough operation, people who traditionally vote for a party may not like the nominee, but if they are worked enough, they can get their votes banked in those early states, in those states that have early voting, or they can get to the polls. So they may be going to the polls, just not very enthusiastically. And that would be something you might expect on Hillary Clinton's side. On the Republican side, you could see Donald Trump turns out these rallies, amazing, 20,000, 30,000 people showing up, which is a huge burst of enthusiasm. The challenge for him is, what about the rest of the Republican coalition that would need to show up? So he might have intense enthusiasm among part of his base, but then weaker enthusiasm in the rest of the vote that he needs. I think also, as Jamelle Bouie talked about on the show today, there are negative effects to some of his enthusiasm, and what riles up his crowds also appears to have riled up Hispanic voters in Florida and Nevada, which means that their turnout might be higher for Hillary Clinton among that group than it was for Barack Obama. All right, we'll find out soon which of the candidates' strategies actually worked. John Dickerson in Washington. John, thank you.
Thanks, Elaine.